of the many evils attributed to the Emperor Nero, ordering the burning of the city of Rome and using the flames as a dramatic backdrop to recite his poetry on the fall of Troy, is the most spectacular. Compounding his crime, he is supposed to have blamed the local Christian population for the fire. He rounded up a group of them, set them up on crosses, and burned them alive. When encouraged to view these grisly human torches, even the normally bloodthirsty Roman citizenry were horrified by his cruel retribution. But is this story true? Anthony Barrett in Rome is Burning investigates the available evidence for the Great Fire of 64 AD and convincingly argues that no, it mostly isn't. He relies on two main forms of evidence to evaluate what really happened: the archaeological record and the ancient historians who wrote extensively about the fire, Tacitus, Suetonius and Cassius Dio. His interrogations of the motives and methods of those historians is quite lively and interesting. All of them wrote decades or more after the events they describe, and all of them were extremely hostile to Nero. He lays out a convincing case of a sort of literary game of telephone. What began as rumors reported by Tacitus that some people blamed Nero for the fire becomes fact when Suetonius and Dio flatly assert he started it and prevented anyone from putting them out. Further, the story about the burning of the Christians is located only in Tacitus, and Barrett makes a convincing case that this might not even be authentic to him, but a later addition. Though several ancient historians, both pagan and Christian, mention that Nero persecuted Christians, none but Tacitus ties that persecution directly to the fire, dating that later in his reign. In trying to understand exactly how much of the city was destroyed, Barrett reviews the archaeological evidence in some detail. The task is difficult because as part of the rebuilding efforts, Nero ordered the ash and debris cleared and sent away on boats. That, plus 2,000 years of cycles of intensive building has destroyed much of the evidence. Still, he reviews what remains in some tedious detail, building by building. The section of the book examining the aftermath of the fire and Nero's grandiose rebuilding program makes for much more interesting reading. Nero ordered the city to be rebuilt in a more resilient and rational way than before, with wider and straighter streets, and stone instead of wood. More spectacularly, he ordered the construction of two monuments to himself, the colossal statue that probably bore his face, and a gigantic palace complex, the Domus Aurea. Here Barrett writes much more engagingly about the archaeological evidence for the extent and design of the palace, only tiny portions such as the Oppian Wing survive. In making the case for the Great Fire of 64 as a major turning point in history, Barrett offers two reasons. First, he argues convincingly that it fatally undermined Nero's emperorship and led to his downfall 4 years later. Before the fire, Nero's position was secure, but the angerer senators who lost their homes, citizens who had to pay higher taxes to fund the rebuilding effort, and the army whose pay was effectively reduced when he debased the currency, led to conspiracies, revolts, and his eventual desperate suicide. The second reason deals with the long-term result of that currency devaluation. The Roman economy was based on a silver coinage that was 99% pure at the start of his reign. When a currency is based on precious metals, you produce more money for expenses, either by digging it up out of the ground, reducing the size of the coin itself, or reducing the purity of the coin. This section of the book detailing exactly how we know the purity of ancient coins over time is brief but very interesting. Nero reduced the silver coinage to about 80% in 64, surely as an emergency measure to pay for rebuilding. Then in the last year of his reign it rose to 90%, perhaps as Barrett says, a desperate attempt to walk back from an unpopular measure. From there on for the next century, the purity of Roman coins fluctuated but mostly trended downward until a sudden collapse in purity reduced the silver content to about 1%. Blaming the modest devaluation of Nero for the total collapse of the currency more than a century after his death is not totally convincing. The best thing I can say for this book is that it piqued my interest to read more about several areas of Roman history. His short explanations for the history of firefighting in Rome, the expected role for an emperor to play in times of emergency, and the question of just how much history, and which historians, did later Romans read were all brief but fascinating subjects.